That night, I stood at a wedding tasting I almost entirely funded, only to hear my stepdaughter raise a glass and say, "Thanks to our little helper," like I was an overstaying waitress. Everyone laughed. The loudest laugh belonged to my husband. I did not throw my wine or scream. I simply stopped holding up the building resting on my back. When the invoices, loans, and lies demanded answers, I did not need revenge. Reality handled him. My name is Aria Crawford. You probably would not notice me if you walked into Ashmore Fields on a Saturday evening. You would see the reclaimed barn wood, the Edison bulbs strung like glass pearls across the twilight sky, and the sweeping Kentucky bluegrass rolling out toward the horizon. You would definitely see my husband, Holden Bell. He would be standing near the bourbon tasting bar, holding a glass of amber liquid, laughing with clients, projecting the exact image of a Southern gentleman who built a luxury wedding empire out of sheer vision and charm. What you would not see is me, quietly signaling the catering staff to slow down the appetizers because the main course is running 12 minutes behind. Today was the tasting dinner for Holden's daughter, Piper. Her wedding was exactly 6 weeks away. I had been on the property since 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The early autumn air outside Lexington was crisp, but inside the main venue hall, the stress was suffocating. I spent the first 3 hours of my day doing the things no one else wanted to do. I cross-checked the floral arrangements against the vendor contracts, noting that the white hydrangeas were beginning to wilt at the edges. I rearranged the seating chart for the 3rd time because Vanessa, Holden's ex-wife and Piper's mother, refused to sit at a table that did not have a direct, unobstructed view of the sweetheart table. I approved the final wine invoices, signing my name on a tab that ran into the thousands of dollars, knowing the funds would be automatically pulled from my personal checking account to cover the venue's operating deficit. I even cleaned the bridal dressing room. Piper and her bridesmaids had used it earlier for a dress fitting and left it looking like a silk and tulle grenade had detonated. I picked up discarded champagne flutes, folded stray robes, and wiped smeared lip gloss off the antique vanity mirror. I did it all silently. I always did it silently. By 7 o'clock in the evening, the tasting dinner officially began. The grand farm table was set under the property's oldest oak tree, illuminated by hanging lanterns. It was a picturesque scene, straight out of a high-end bridal magazine. The guest list was intimate but heavy with expectations. There was Holden, sitting at the head of the table, radiating effortless charisma. To his right sat Piper, glowing in a white silk slip dress, and her fiancé, Grant Mercer. Grant came from a family whose wealth was old, quiet, and deeply rooted in equestrian estates. His parents, Richard and Eleanor Mercer, sat opposite them, nodding politely at Holden's sprawling tales of renovating the property. Vanessa Bell sat across from me, sipping her sparkling water with a posture that suggested she was enduring a minor inconvenience. Rounding out the table were the wedding planner, a high-strung woman named Sloane, and 2 key vendors who were desperately trying to secure the Mercer family's approval. The dinner service began. The waitstaff brought out plates of seared scallops and braised short ribs. I kept my eyes on the perimeter. I noticed when a waiter accidentally bumped a chair, and I offered a subtle nod to the floor manager to correct the spacing. I was the invisible engine keeping the entire machine running. Holden held court. He poured a 2018 Pinot Noir for Richard Mercer, swirling the glass with practiced ease. "It is all about the atmosphere, Richard," Holden said, his voice smooth and commanding. "When I first bought this land, people told me I was crazy, a rundown horse farm. But you have to see the potential in the dirt. You have to know how to build an experience from the ground up. He smiled, taking a sip. He did not mention that the initial deposit came from my savings. He did not mention that the commercial loan was secured against my credit, or that I owned 72% of the limited liability company. In Holden's narrative, he was the lone architect of this rustic paradise. I was just the supportive wife clapping from the audience. Dessert arrived, a tiered masterpiece of lemon buttercream and wild berry compote. As the plates were cleared, Piper stood up. She tapped her silver fork against her crystal champagne flute. The light catching the massive diamond on her left hand commanded the table's attention. "I just want to say a few words," Piper began, her voice breathy and practiced. She looked at Grant, then at her mother, Vanessa, who offered a tight, proud smile. "This whole planning process has been so overwhelming. But looking around tonight, seeing this beautiful setup, I am just so grateful. Grant and I are incredibly lucky." She raised her glass toward her father. "Dad, thank you. You have created a literal fairy tale for us. I know how hard you worked to make this venue the best in the state." Holden beamed, raising his own glass in acknowledgement. Then, Piper's eyes shifted. They slid past the floral centerpiece and landed squarely on me. Her smile remained, but the warmth vanished, replaced by a sharp, gleaming edge. "And of course," Piper said, her tone dripping with a rehearsed sweetness that felt like poison. "Good thing Dad has an in-house logistics department living with us to handle all the boring details." The silence that followed lasted only a fraction of a second, but it felt like an hour. Then, Vanessa chuckled, a soft, breathless sound of amusement. Grant's mother, Eleanor, smiled politely, assuming it was a charming family inside joke. The wedding planner let out a nervous laugh. Within moments, the entire table was chuckling. I did not look at Piper. I looked at my husband. I looked at the man whose debts I had restructured, whose dreams I had funded, whose failures I had quietly erased for years. Holden was laughing. He was laughing the loudest of them all. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes crinkling with genuine mirth, swirling his wine. "Well," Holden said, his voice booming over the fading chuckles, "Arya likes being useful." He took a drink. He did not look at me. He just took a drink and turned his attention back to Richard Mercer, ready to launch into another story about his visionary renovations. There was a time, perhaps a year ago, or even 6 months ago, when I would have felt the familiar hot sting of tears behind my eyes. I would have felt the crushing weight of injustice. I would have waited until we were alone in our bedroom, away from the guests, and I would have argued with him. I would have demanded an apology. I would have explained, for the 100th time, how much labor I poured into his life just to keep him afloat. And he would have used his signature tactic. He would have told me I was overreacting, that I was taking a harmless joke too seriously, that I needed to stop making everything so tense. But sitting at that table, under the soft glow of the Edison bulbs, I felt absolutely nothing. The anger did not rise. The tears did not form. Instead, a profound, crystalline clarity settled over me. It was as cold and sharp as winter ice. I looked down at my hands. Wrapped around my left wrist was a coiled black band holding the heavy brass master keys to Ashmore Fields. These keys unlock the main office, the liquor storage, the electrical panels, the vendor entrances. Next to my water glass was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Inside that ledger was the precise, detailed schedule of every payment required to keep this venue from collapsing over the next 30 days. I did not slam my hand on the table. I did not throw my wine into Holden's smug face. I did not scream at Piper for her entitlement. I simply reached to my left wrist. I uncoiled the black band. The heavy brass keys slid off my skin with a faint, metallic clinking sound. I placed the keys deliberately on top of the leather ledger. I aligned the edges perfectly. I picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly into a square, and set it beside my plate. I took one final sip of my water, leaning back in my chair, and rested my hands in my lap. I sat there for the remainder of the evening, perfectly still, perfectly polite, and completely detached. I watched them eat. I watched them laugh. I watched them consume the environment I had painstakingly built, completely oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath them had just vanished. 2 hours later, the tasting dinner concluded. Handshakes were exchanged, cheeks were kissed, and cars were valeted. Holden was still busy entertaining the Mercers near the main gates. I did not wait for him. I walked to my car, a sensible gray sedan parked behind the lavish vendor trucks. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The dashboard clock read 11 o'clock at night. I put the car in drive and guided it down the long gravel driveway. The tires crunched rhythmically beneath me. I did not look back at the illuminated barn or the rolling fields. I kept my eyes on the dark road ahead. My hands were perfectly calm on the leather steering wheel. My breathing was slow and even. Inside my mind, I pictured a massive, complex circuit board. For years, I had been running from switch to switch, desperately rerouting power, taking on electric shocks, exhausting myself to keep the lights on in Holden's world. As I turned onto the highway, merging into the quiet midnight traffic, I visualized reaching out and pulling the main breaker. I just switched off the last thing that made me want to save that house. The darkness was finally going to fall. I am 41 years old. My days are not spent picking out linen swatches, tasting lemon buttercream, or curating aesthetic mood boards. I am a senior director of risk management at Redthorn Assurance. My entire professional existence revolves around finding the exact stress point where a structure, a business, or a legally binding contract will collapse. I analyze casualty risk, I draft complex indemnity clauses, and I read the fine print that other people gloss over because they are too blinded by the excitement of a big idea. I make a very substantial, very reliable six-figure income by understanding exactly what happens when things fall apart. When I met Holden 5 years ago, he was a man entirely composed of big ideas and no fine print. He possessed an intoxicating vision of building a luxury Southern wedding venue. He had the rugged charm, the right polo club connections, and a mind full of sweeping concepts involving reclaimed wood, crystal chandeliers, and artisanal bourbon tastings. What he did not have was a reliable income history, a functional credit score, or a single bank in the state of Kentucky willing to lend him a dime. I was the one who pulled Ashmore Fields out of his imagination and forced it into the physical world. When we found the property, it was a beautiful but rapidly decaying horse farm. The asking price was staggering. Holden tried to charm the aging owner into some sort of creative seller financing arrangement. It failed miserably. The owner wanted cash, and he wanted a clean closing. So, I stepped in. I liquidated a massive portion of my personal stock portfolio to cover the heavy down payment. I sat in a sterile bank office and signed my name on the commercial mortgage. I put my flawless personal credit on the line as the sole guarantor. when the renovation budget inevitably spiraled out of control. I funded the contractors who ripped out the rotted horse stalls and installed the commercial catering kitchen and the reinforced grand ballroom floor. Legally, on the operating agreement that sits locked inside a fireproof safe in my home office, I own 72% of the limited liability company. Holden owns exactly 28%. But because I loathe the spotlight, because I prefer the quiet security of the background, and because I loved my husband, I let him play the visionary. I let the town, the high-end vendors, and his entire family believe he built this bridal empire with his own bare hands and his sheer force of will. They see the glamour. They see the sold-out spring and autumn weekends where the champagne flows and the revenue looks massive on paper. They do not see January and February, during the dead of winter, when the venue sits empty and the cash flow drops to absolute zero. The financial obligations do not stop. The commercial property liability insurance premiums, the massive electrical bills to keep the pipes from freezing in the barns, the legal retainers, and the payroll for the part-time groundskeepers still hit the ledger every single month. Every winter, I log into my Red Thorn Assurance payroll portal and silently divert thousands of dollars from my corporate salary directly into the Ashmore Fields operating account. I patch the holes. I keep the ship afloat. Holden never checks the balance because the debit card never declines. To him, the venue is a magical, self-sustaining entity fueled entirely by his charisma and local popularity. He has no concept of the invisible safety net strung tightly beneath his feet. Then there is Piper. 2 years ago, she went through a remarkably messy breakup with a man she met in college. She needed a place to stay to get back on her feet. On the far edge of the Ashmore property, hidden behind a grove of weeping willows, sits a charming 3-bedroom farmhouse. I originally planned to renovate it into a premium bridal suite or a high-end short-term rental to generate crucial off-season income. Instead, Holden handed Piper the keys. He assured me it would only be for 3 or 4 months. 2 years later, she is still there. She has repainted the living room, planted a massive vegetable garden, and completely claimed the space as her permanent territory. Worse, she has claimed the narrative. I have stood quietly in the kitchen and listened to her tell her friends that she is hosting them at her dad's family estate. She treats the farmhouse like her divine birthright, completely oblivious to the fact that I am the one who pays the crushing property taxes on the roof over her head every single November. Over the years, whenever Piper made a passive-aggressive comment about my presence, or whenever Holden's ex-wife Vanessa treated me like a hired event coordinator during family gatherings, I would try to talk to Holden about it. I never asked for a grand, screaming confrontation. I just wanted my husband to gently correct the record. I wanted him to say, "Actually, Aria is my equal partner in this." But Holden has a very specific, deeply toxic way of managing conflict. He avoids it entirely by shrinking my feelings until they disappear. If I told him a vendor ignored my emails but replied instantly to his, he would sigh, rub my shoulders, and tell me I was reading too much into a simple oversight. If I pointed out Piper's blatant disrespect, he would give me a weary, exhausted look. "Do not make things so tense, Aria," he would say softly, making me feel like the villain for simply asking for basic human respect. "You know how she gets. Just let it go. We are a family." He weaponized my competence and my desperate desire for peace. I always let it go because I thought the foundation of our marriage was solid, even if the surface was rocky. I confused being heavily relied upon with being truly loved. I thought the disrespect was just a series of isolated incidents, the unavoidable byproduct of a blended family navigating growing pains. But that was the lie I told myself, so I could keep writing the checks and keeping the peace. The tasting dinner stripped that illusion away completely. As I drove down the dark highway back toward the city limits of Lexington, the risk manager inside me finally audited my own life. I looked at the data without emotion. The laughter at that dinner table was not a slip of the tongue. It was their operating system. I realized they were not momentarily careless. They were not just a little self-involved or stressed about a wedding. They had fundamentally adapted to living on my back. Holden and Piper had built their entire identities, their social standing, and their daily comforts on a platform completely sustained by my invisible labor, my financial risk, and my silent, endless endurance. They truly believed I existed solely to facilitate their starring roles in a life I was paying for. And the most devastating part was that I had let them believe it. I had trained them to treat me this way by constantly buffering them from the consequences of their own financial and social actions. I was the structural support beam they forgot was there because it never buckled. But a support beam can be removed. I did not need to yell. I did not need to hire a private investigator or enact some elaborate, dramatic scheme to ruin their lives. I just needed to stop doing the things I was never thanked for. As the city lights of Lexington began to glow brightly on the horizon, I made the easiest risk management decision of my entire career. I was going to let reality introduce itself to my husband. I woke up at 6 o'clock the following morning. The light filtering through the bedroom blinds was gray and sterile. Holden was already in the shower, humming a tune that echoed off the subway tile. My phone, resting face down on the cherry wood nightstand, vibrated softly. I reached over and flipped it up. It was a text message from Holden, sent just before he stepped into the water. Hey, did you confirm the cake tasting schedule for Thursday at 2 o'clock? There was no mention of the previous night. There was no acknowledgement of the humiliation. No apology for the laughter. No recognition of the fact that I had walked out and driven home alone. To him. The slate was wiped clean by a new sunrise. A few seconds later, a second notification popped up. It was from Piper. Need you to approve an extra $1,200 for the vintage photo booth. The vendor needs the deposit by noon today, or we lose the reservation. I stared at the glowing screen. They truly believed the ecosystem would simply continue to function. They thought my compliance was a natural resource, as infinite and guaranteed as the oxygen in the room. I did not reply to either of them. I walked down the hall to my home office, a room Holden rarely entered because it lacked reclaimed wood and bourbon. I sat at my desk, booted up my work laptop, and opened a secure browser window. I logged into my primary personal banking portal. The interface loaded, displaying a healthy balance accumulated from years of corporate risk management bonuses. I navigated to the Automated Transfers tab. There it was, the quiet little engine that kept Ashmore Fields breathing during the lean months. On the first day of every single month, an automated clearinghouse transfer pulled a substantial, four-figure sum from my personal account and deposited it directly into the venue's operating fund. It was the money that covered the gaps when Holden undercharged a friend or overspent on aesthetic upgrades. I hovered my cursor over the active transfer rule. I clicked the button to terminate it. A pop-up window asked me to confirm the cancellation. I clicked yes. I did not drain the business accounts. I did not touch a single penny that legally belonged to the limited liability company. Sabotage is sloppy, and it opens you up to legal retaliation. I am a professional who understands the strict boundaries of contractual obligations. I simply stopped being the volunteer donor. I stopped acting as the human life preserver for a ship whose captain insisted on steering into the rocks. Next, I opened a new browser tab and navigated to a completely different financial institution, a massive national bank where Holden did not know the branch manager and could not charm his way into a courtesy balance check. I opened an individual checking and a high-yield savings account in my name only. I transferred my entire personal emergency fund, my untouched stock dividends, and my upcoming quarterly bonus into that new isolated vault. Finally, I logged into the joint checking account that Holden used for his daily expenses and disabled the overdraft protection feature. The invisible safety net was officially gone. By 9 o'clock in the morning, Holden had left the house to play 18 holes of golf with a potential corporate retreat client. Piper was presumably still asleep in the farmhouse across the property. The main house was entirely mine. I went upstairs to the master bedroom and pulled a hard-shell rolling suitcase from the top shelf of the walk-in closet. I packed with clinical efficiency. I packed my tailored blazers, my silk blouses, my running shoes, and my toiletries. I packed my corporate laptop and the encrypted external hard drives containing the meticulous financial ledgers I had kept for the venue. I walked through the sprawling downstairs living areas and took absolutely nothing else. I did not take the imported espresso machine I had purchased last Christmas. I did not take the expensive velvet throw pillows or the antique rugs. If the limited liability company or the joint account had paid for an item, I left it exactly where it was. I wanted a mathematically clean exit. I left my wedding ring sitting dead center on the marble counter of the bathroom vanity. I had already secured a furnished, short-term corporate apartment in downtown Lexington. I signed a month-to-month lease online while drinking my morning coffee. But before I drove to my new sanctuary, I had one final administrative task to complete on the property. I drove my sedan down the gravel path to the venue's main administrative office, located inside a beautifully converted grain silo. I unlocked the heavy wooden door for the last time. The office smelled of expensive leather and dried eucalyptus. I sat down at the reception desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a single sheet of crisp white printer paper. I did not write an emotional letter. I did not detail my grievances, demand an apology, or explain my departure. I simply wrote a heading at the top of the page: Accounts payable for the next 21 days. Beneath that heading, I created a strictly itemized list. I wrote down the name of the commercial liability insurance provider and the exact premium amount due in 9 days. I listed the utility company and the balance required to keep the electricity flowing to the reception barns. I listed the state payroll tax deadline and the outstanding invoices for the premium linen service and the groundskeeping crew. I wrote down the exact dollar amounts and the unyielding due dates. I left the piece of paper dead center on Holden's massive oak desk, right next to his monogrammed leather coaster. I offered no instructions on how to pay them. I offered no advice on which accounts to pull from, because I knew the operating account was currently too low to cover even half of the list. I just left the cold, hard math waiting for him. I locked the office door, got into my car, and drove away from Ashmore Fields. When I arrived at my new apartment, the space was perfectly sterile, modern, and quiet. The hum of the city traffic outside the window was a comforting, anonymous sound. I unpacked my suitcase and set up my workstation on the small glass dining table. My phone buzzed against the glass. It was a text from Holden. "Are you giving me the silent treatment today? Come on, Arya. Do not be like this. I am tired of this game. Call me when you calm down and are ready to be reasonable. He truly believed this was a temporary theatrical performance. He thought I was pouting in a hotel somewhere, using silence as a weapon to force an apology out of him. He thought I was waiting for him to coax me back into my designated role. I ignored the message and opened a social media application on my phone. The algorithm immediately served me a new video posted by Piper. She was standing in the middle of the main ballroom at the venue, doing a slow spin in a different, even more elaborate white dress. The afternoon sunlight caught the sequins on the bodice. Her caption read, "Counting down the days until I marry my absolute soulmate at my family's beautiful castle. I am so blessed." I locked my phone and set it aside. A profound sense of calm washed over me. The tension that had lived in my shoulders for 5 years simply evaporated. Looking out the window at the Lexington skyline, I felt the very first ripple of the impending reality. To the outside world, to the brides booking their dates, and to the vendors cashing their checks. Ashmore Fields looked like a luxurious, romantic, perfectly complete machine. It looked like a castle built on solid bedrock. But I knew the truth. It was a fragile, desperate engine that only ran because I had been standing quietly in the background, shoveling my own resources into the furnace to keep the fires burning. They had consumed my effort for so long they forgot it existed. They thought the machine ran on its own magic. They were about to learn exactly how heavy a castle is when the foundation simply walks away. 72 hours later, the very first domino tipped over. It was small, quiet, and deeply predictable. My cell phone vibrated on the glass dining table of my apartment. It was a text message from Chloe, the bright-eyed college student who worked as a part-time event coordinator for Ashmore Fields. "Hi, I am so sorry to bother you on your day off. My direct deposit did not hit my bank account this morning. Is there an issue with the payroll software? In previous months, whenever revenues did not align perfectly with the payroll schedule, I would quietly log into the administrative portal. I would see that Holden had drained the operating account to purchase custom engraved bourbon barrels or vintage lounge furniture, leaving nothing for the staff. I would then transfer $2,000 or $3,000 of my own money to cover the gap, ensuring Chloe and the groundskeepers could pay their rent on time." I stared at the message. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I felt a brief, familiar tug of guilt for the girl, but I suppressed it. I typed a simple, factual reply. "Hello, Chloe. I am no longer handling the accounts or operations for Ashmore Fields. Please direct all payroll inquiries directly to Holden." By Wednesday afternoon, the ecosystem was actively collapsing. The premium linen supplier, a massive corporate operation based out of Louisville that provided our heavy silk napkins and velvet table runners, sent an automated email. I was still copied on the vendor distribution list. The email stated that their services were immediately suspended due to a 90-day past due balance of $4,500. Simultaneously, Sloan, the high-strung wedding planner from the tasting dinner, began blowing up Holden's phone. She was managing a massive corporate retreat scheduled for that coming Saturday. She desperately needed the updated certificate of liability insurance. Without that specific piece of paper, the high-end caterers and the unionized bartending staff legally could not step foot onto the property. At 4 o'clock on Thursday, my phone rang. Holden's name flashed across the screen. I answered on the third ring, my voice perfectly level. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded the second the line connected. The smooth, charming Southern gentleman was completely gone. He sounded breathless, erratic, and genuinely panicked. The linen vendor is threatening to cancel the entire weekend order, and Sloan is having an absolute meltdown about some insurance document. Did you forget to pay these invoices before you went to your little hotel? I did not forget anything, I replied, staring out the window at the afternoon city traffic. Then fix it, he snapped, the entitlement thick in his throat. Log in and pay the vendor, and email Sloan the certificate. Do not make a massive deal out of this just because of one stupid comment Piper made at dinner. You are overreacting, and you are punishing the business because your feelings got hurt. I am not punishing anyone, Holden, I said softly, the ice in my voice crystallizing. I am simply not doing anything at all. I am no longer financing the deficits of your business with my corporate salary. I left a detailed list of the payable accounts on your desk. You will need to handle them. Arya, do not be ridiculous. I do not have the cash liquid for the insurance premium right now. You know that, he pleaded, his anger shifting rapidly into desperation. Then you should not have bought those imported leather chairs for the cigar lounge last month, I said. Goodbye. Holden. I ended the call. I did not block his number. I wanted him to be able to reach me so I could continue saying no. The real public humiliation arrived on Sunday during the venue's scheduled autumn open house. This was a critical event designed to secure venue bookings for the next calendar year. Holden had expected over 150 potential brides, grooms, and their wealthy parents. It turned into a spectacular, slow-motion disaster. The electronic wrought iron front gates at the main entrance refused to open. The monthly subscription for the automated security software had lapsed because the credit card on file, my old corporate card, had been deactivated. Cars backed up onto the two-lane rural highway for nearly a mile, creating a symphony of angry horns. When Holden finally managed to jog down the long gravel driveway and manually override the heavy iron gates, he was sweating through his tailored suit. The guests poured into the main administrative office to register, only to find the Wi-Fi completely dead. The internet provider had cut the service at midnight for non-payment. Holden, trying to maintain his signature charismatic smile, attempted to print physical copies of the pricing brochures and venue maps. The leased commercial printer flashed a red error code and refused to operate. The maintenance and ink contract had expired 3 days prior. Desperate, he turned to Marcus, his lead groundskeeper, and asked him to run to a local print shop in town to make 50 copies. Marcus looked at him blankly, shifting his weight. Marcus explained that he could not do that unless Arya approved the petty cash expenditure and handed him the company card. In that humiliating moment, surrounded by annoyed couples fanning themselves with their cell phones and failing technology, Holden experienced a brutal revelation. He realized that the staff he proudly called his dedicated team did not actually report to him. They took their final directions, their approvals, and their paychecks from me. He was just the handsome face on the promotional brochures. I was the actual boss. Without me, his authority was a complete illusion. The shockwaves of the open house disaster reached the farmhouse very quickly. Piper, who spent her days obsessing over her own upcoming event, suddenly realized the gravity of the situation. She discovered that the canceled liability insurance and the angry, striking vendors directly threatened her own perfect day. The realization that her dream wedding might actually be derailed sent her into a tailspin. True to her nature, she did not ask her father how he planned to fix his failing business. She did not offer to get a job to help cover the outstanding linen invoices. Instead, She directed her fury entirely at the woman who had stopped serving her. She sent me a massive, venomous text message. "You are absolutely unbelievable," Piper wrote. "You are so incredibly selfish and toxic. You are literally trying to ruin someone else's wedding day just because you want to be the center of attention and control my dad. He is stressed out of his mind because of your little temper tantrum. You need to come back. Pay the vendors. And fix this right now." I read the message twice. I marveled at the sheer, unadulterated delusion it took to type those words. She still genuinely viewed Ashmore Fields as her royal birthright. And she viewed me as a rebellious servant who had forgotten her place. She called me selfish for refusing to spend my own money on her luxury party. I deleted the message and permanently blocked her number. I felt absolutely nothing. However, the most dangerous consequence of my absence did not come from an angry bride, a frustrated wedding planner, or an entitled stepdaughter. The true killing blow arrived on Monday morning, delivered by the United States Postal Service in a plain, brown manila envelope. It was an official notice from the county fire marshal. The letter detailed an upcoming, mandatory inspection regarding the structural load capacity and the fire safety suppression systems in the main renovated reception barn. In previous years, I would have intercepted that letter the moment it arrived. I would have quietly hired a private contractor to update the chemical fire extinguishers, tested the emergency exit lighting, reviewed the architectural load limits, and paid the heavy municipal permitting fees long before an inspector ever set foot on the property. I would have ensured the venue passed with flying colors, keeping the doors legally open. Now, that critical letter was sitting in a rusted metal mailbox at the end of Ashmore Fields' driveway. It was waiting for a man who had absolutely no idea how to read municipal safety codes, who did not have the funds to pay for the required regulatory upgrades, and who was already drowning in unpaid linen bills. The cracks in the foundation were no longer just visible. The walls were actively beginning to cave in, and gravity was about to collect its debt. The law offices of Pike and Associates occupied the top floor of a glass high-rise in downtown Lexington. The environment was the exact opposite of the rustic, reclaimed charm of the wedding venue. Here, everything was sharp edges, polished steel, and soundproof glass. It was exactly what I needed. I sat at a long mahogany conference table across from Dana Pike, my attorney for the last decade, and Miles Rendon, an independent forensic accountant I had retained earlier that week. Dana was a woman who spoke exclusively in actionable verbs and legal precedents. Miles was quiet, methodical, and possessed the personality of a metronome. Spread across the table between us were the complete, unredacted financial records of our limited liability company, including the operating accounts, the sales tax remissions, and the corporate credit card statements spanning the last 3 years. I had asked them to look for structural weaknesses. What I found was a systematic excavation of my life. Miles adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and opened a thick white binder. He did not offer sympathetic smiles. He just presented the data. "The commingling of funds is extensive. Aria," Miles began, his voice flat and analytical. "Over the past 24 months, Holden has routinely utilized the corporate expense accounts for personal liabilities. It is not just a matter of sloppy bookkeeping. It is a pattern of deliberate redirection." He slid a highlighted bank statement across the polished wood. My eyes scanned the lines. There was a charge for $2,800 paid to a luxury exotic car rental agency in Atlanta. The date aligned perfectly with the weekend Piper flew down to Georgia to try on designer wedding gowns with her bridesmaids. Holden had expensed a top-tier luxury sport utility vehicle for her trip, categorizing it under the ledger as out-of-state vendor transportation. Miles slid another document forward. Here is a resort charge for $4,200 in Savannah. Booked 3 days after Piper and Grant announced their engagement. It was categorized as a venue inspiration tour. There were dozens of smaller cuts. 2. Receipts for premium steakhouses in town totaling $600 or $800 a night, filed under client acquisition dinners. I knew for a fact that Holden was eating those dinners with his golf buddies, because we had not acquired a single client from those specific social circles in over 2 years. He was using the business I financed as his personal slush fund to maintain the illusion of a wealthy, carefree patriarch. I stared at the numbers. I felt the familiar urge to rationalize it, to tell myself he was just disorganized. But the risk manager inside me shut that instinct down permanently. The numbers were not careless. They were selfish. But the stolen money was only the beginning. Dana leaned forward, folding her hands over a manila folder. The financial misappropriation is problematic, but it is recoverable, Dana said, her tone growing sharper. What concerns me more is the liability exposure regarding his representations to third parties. We subpoenaed the business email server yesterday. You need to read these. She handed me a stack of printed emails. They were correspondence between Holden and Richard Mercer, Grant's wealthy father. The subject lines were casually titled with things like future planning and joining the families. I read the top email. Holden was bragging about the upcoming wedding, painting a picture of a grand, merging dynasty. Then, halfway down the page, my breath caught in my throat. Holden had written, "Once the kids tie the knot and settle down, we are looking forward to Piper stepping up and gradually taking over the venue operations. It is a family legacy, and it will be incredible to see her run the show when the time is right." My hands turned to ice. He was giving it away. He was negotiating with my company, leveraging the 72% ownership stake that I legally held, and offering it up to his daughter as a dowry to impress his future in-laws. He was treating my financial sacrifice as his personal property to distribute. "There is more," Dana said quietly. "Look at the forwarded text messages on the next page. They are between Holden and Piper." I flipped the page. The messages were from 6 months ago, right after Piper had demanded a massive renovation to the farmhouse kitchen. I had originally denied the request, citing the lack of return on investment for a property that was supposed to be a temporary favor. Holden had texted her behind my back. "Do not worry about the kitchen right now. Sweetie, just let the dust settle. The farmhouse will belong to you soon enough anyway. It is your home." A sickening realization washed over me. This was why Piper strutted around the property like royalty. This was why she looked at me like I was a temporary nuisance. Holden had made her a verbal promise that she would inherit the farmhouse. He promised her a house where her name appeared nowhere on the deed. She had contributed $0 to the down payment. She carried zero liability for the commercial mortgage. I was the sole guarantor. I paid the exorbitant property taxes every single November out of my own corporate bonus. Yet, my husband had handed her the crown to a kingdom I had built. "If you continue to operate under the status quo," Miles interjected, pulling my attention back to the spreadsheet, "you are legally subsidizing a machine designed to drain you. You are carrying 100% of the financial and legal risk, while they extract all the capital and social equity. If the business defaults, the bank will not go after Holden's charm or Piper's wedding dress. They will attach the liens to your personal assets. They will take your retirement accounts." I closed the folder. The silence in the room was absolute. I did not feel the sting of betrayal anymore. I just felt the cold, hard steel of a severed tie. "What are the parameters for dissolution?" I asked, my voice completely steady. Dana gave a small, approving nod. She slid a single sheet of paper toward me.
"We do not negotiate based on emotion," Dana stated. "We negotiate based on the operating agreement. You have two logical paths forward. Option 1 is a forced buyout. We issue a formal demand."
Holden has exactly 30 days to source legitimate, verifiable outside capital to purchase your 72% share at current fair market value, plus full reimbursement for the misappropriated funds. Given his credit history, securing a loan of that magnitude will be nearly impossible. She tapped her pen on the desk. Option 2 is liquidation, if he cannot produce the capital within the window. The operating agreement dictates that we force the immediate sale of both Ashmore Fields and the farmhouse on the open market. We liquidate the assets, clear the commercial debts, and you take your 72% of the remaining profit. He gets whatever is left. I looked at the two options. I could imagine the absolute chaos this would cause. I could picture Piper screaming, Vanessa posting passive-aggressive essays online, and Holden begging for mercy. I did not want a loud, screaming revenge. I refused to lower myself to a screaming match in a driveway. I was not going to write a dramatic social media post exposing his fraud, and I was not going to call our mutual friends to cry about being used. That kind of revenge was messy, and it gave them a reason to call me crazy. I chose the surgeon's knife. I chose the absolute, terrifying power of pristine documents, undeniable numbers, and complete silence. "Draft the demand for the forced buyout," I told Dana, standing up from the heavy leather chair. "Set the deadline exactly as the contract states. Do not accept any extensions. Do not take his phone calls. And direct all of his communications straight to your paralegal." I left the law office and drove back to my quiet, sterile apartment. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the city. I sat at my glass dining table and opened my laptop one last time for the day. I looked at the venue's master calendar. There was one final, massive event scheduled for the last weekend of the current month. It was a high-profile corporate gala. I knew the operating account was currently overdrawn. I knew the final payments for the premium catering staff, the floral designers, and the unionized lighting technicians were due in exactly 48 hours. I knew that a single wire transfer of $10,000 from my personal savings would cover the deficit. It would allow the event to happen. It would buy the venue a few more weeks of oxygen. It would give Holden time to scramble. I hovered my cursor over the banking portal. I thought about the luxury car rental. I thought about the email giving away my company. I thought about the laughter at the tasting dinner. I did not click the transfer button. I closed the laptop, pushed it away, and walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. I decided to let the silence do the talking. The final event of the month was not going to happen, and the reality I had shielded him from was finally going to break down his front door. Word of mouth is a ruthless and terrifying force within the luxury wedding industry. The autumn brides, women who had booked their dates 18 months in advance and paid exorbitant deposits, were beginning to sense the rot spreading beneath the floorboards. I was no longer actively monitoring the central corporate email inbox, but the frantic industry gossip reached me anyway. Brides were continuously calling the main office, asking highly pointed questions about the venue's financial stability and operational guarantees. The remaining part-time staff members were giving evasive, stuttering answers because they genuinely did not know what was happening. To make matters substantially worse, the premier floral designer in the county, a woman who imported rare orchids and Dutch tulips for high-net-worth clients, officially halted all deliveries to Ashmore Fields. Holden owed her nearly $8,000 from the spring season. She did not keep the dispute private. She sent a mass email to her current roster of clients, stating she would no longer service events at our location until her outstanding invoices were cleared in full. The panic was rapidly setting in across the property, but instead of confronting the terrifying reality of the ledger, Piper decided to aggressively play pretend. She attempted to host an exclusive bridal brunch on the farmhouse patio. It was a desperate, transparent move designed to signal to her affluent friends and the watching public that the rumors were false and that her kingdom was perfectly intact. She invited 12 bridesmaids and local socialites, promising them a gourmet, 5-course tasting menu paired with vintage champagne. However, the private chef she had contracted, a highly sought-after culinary artist from Louisville, required a 50% deposit exactly 72 hours before the event. Piper, operating under the deeply ingrained assumption that her father would simply wave a magic wand or that my automated bank transfers would somehow resurrect themselves from the dead, completely ignored the invoice. On the morning of the brunch, with 12 wealthy women sitting at a long table decorated with wilting hydrangeas and empty crystal flutes, the chef simply did not show up. There was no food arriving. There was no apology message sent. There was only the agonizing, humiliating silence of a fully catered luxury event with absolutely no caterer. Piper was forced to order generic sandwich platters from a local grocery store, her face burning with a shame she could not articulate to her friends. Holden's response to the collapsing facade was entirely predictable. He leaned heavily into the only professional skill he actually possessed. He lied. He stood in front of angry vendors, panicked brides, and his own humiliated daughter, and he smiled his charming, devastating Southern smile. "It is just a temporary banking glitch," he told them over and over, his voice as smooth and reassuring as aged bourbon. "We are currently transitioning our corporate operating accounts to a new national branch, and the wire transfers are caught in a ridiculous bureaucratic holding pattern. I assure you, everything will be completely resolved by Tuesday morning." He delivered the lie flawlessly, looking people directly in the eye. The problem was that a lie of that magnitude only works when someone is standing silently behind the curtain, frantically writing the actual checks to make the illusion eventually come true. He kept waiting for the magical rescue. He kept waiting for the dominoes to miraculously stand back up on their own, assuming I would eventually cave to the pressure. But the room behind the curtain was completely empty. Sensing the shifting tides, Vanessa, Piper's mother, decided to enter the fray. She was smart enough not to attack me directly, because she knew I possessed the legal and financial documents that could instantly ruin her daughter's entire social narrative. Instead, she chose the cowardly route of digital passive aggression. She posted a lengthy, carefully curated statement on her social media pages. It featured a professionally edited picture of Piper looking stressed but beautiful, staring out over the Ashmore horse pastures. The caption was a masterclass in toxic manipulation. "It absolutely breaks a mother's heart to see her daughter's special season clouded by unnecessary drama," Vanessa wrote. "Weddings should be a sacred time when the adults in the room put their egos aside and prioritize family happiness above selfish, vindictive behavior. True grace is knowing when to support the people you love." not abandoning them when things get a little complicated. The public implication was obvious to anyone in their social circle. I was the villain. I was the cruel, heartless stepmother intentionally destroying a young girl's fairy tale out of sheer spite. In the past, a public post like that would have sent my heart racing with anxiety. I would have felt a desperate, clawing need to defend my character, to post screenshots of the unpaid vendor bills, to scream the truth into the void so people would know I was not the bad guy. This time, sitting in my sterile apartment overlooking the city, I did not even flinch. I did not leave a comment. I did not text Holden to demand he force Vanessa to take it down. I did not draft a frantic rebuttal. My absolute, unwavering silence terrified them infinitely more than any screaming match ever could. Holden, Piper, and Vanessa were emotional vampires. They desperately needed me to engage. They needed me to yell, to cry, or to hurl accusations so they could point their fingers and confidently label me as the hysterical, unreasonable woman who was ruining everything by completely refusing to step into the ring. I starved them of their favorite defense mechanism. They were left punching at shadows, looking increasingly unstable and desperate to anyone paying close attention to the unfolding disaster. The internal structure of the business was completely dissolving under the pressure. Sarah, a veteran wedding coordinator who had been the backbone of Ashmore Fields since our second year of operation, officially submitted her resignation. She did not leave quietly, and she did not give 2 weeks of notice. She left a printed letter dead center on the reception desk in the main office, making sure every remaining employee saw it before they locked up. I cannot, in good professional conscience, continue to sign contracts and make false promises to young couples when I know the true operational foundation of this business has left the building, Sarah wrote in sharp, black ink. The person who actually ran this venue and paid the bills is gone. I absolutely refuse to attach my career and my professional reputation to a sinking ship. Her departure was a devastating, unrecoverable blow. Sarah held the institutional knowledge of exactly how the venue operated during an active crisis. Without her handling the panicked brides and furious vendors, Holden was truly flying blind into a hurricane. Then, the weather decided to participate in the physical dismantling of the property. On a late Thursday evening, a massive, unseasonable rainstorm rolled aggressively across the Kentucky plains. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain came down in heavy, punishing sheets that battered the old structures. 10 months prior, I had proactively scheduled a commercial roofing contractor to repair a known structural weakness over the east wing of the main reception barn. The official quote for the preventative maintenance was $12,000. Holden had explicitly canceled the work order behind my back. He had argued passionately that $12,000 would be much better spent installing a custom, imported Italian marble fire pit on the outdoor patio, simply because the fire pit would look much better in the promotional photographs for the brochure. The storm ruthlessly exposed his priorities. The compromised roof over the east wing failed completely under the weight of the water. Rain poured straight through the ceiling, thoroughly soaking the antique hardwood floors, destroying the custom drywall, and short-circuiting the newly installed, highly expensive lighting rig. The catastrophic damage would now cost at least 3 times as much to repair as the original preventative maintenance quote. Late that night, as the rain continued to pound relentlessly against the reinforced glass windows of my high-rise apartment, my cell phone rang, the screen illuminated with Holden's name. I let it ring 4 distinct times before I finally answered. I did not say hello. I just pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the heavy silence. I could hear the absolute exhaustion in his ragged breathing. The smooth, charming veneer was entirely stripped away, washed out by the rain and the debt. He sounded exactly like a man standing alone in the dark rubble of an earthquake he had personally caused. "The roof collapsed in the east wing," Holden said, his voice hollow, shaking, and completely defeated. "The water is literally everywhere. The custom floors are ruined. I do not know how to fix it. I do not have the money in the account to call the emergency water extraction contractors." He paused. He waited for me to tell him what to do. He waited for me to give him the name of a reliable vendor, to offer my corporate credit card number over the phone, to magically fix the disaster just like I always did. I remained perfectly, terrifyingly silent. "Arya, please," he whispered, his voice cracking with genuine fear. "Are you punishing me? Is this really what you want?" I looked out my window at the glowing city lights, feeling a profound, unshakable peace in my chest. "I am not punishing you, Holden," I replied, my tone entirely devoid of anger, malice, or pity. "I am not doing anything to you at all. I am simply letting you meet the reality I spent 5 years protecting you from. Good night." I ended the call and set the phone face down on the table. In that exact moment, across the dark expanse of the county, he finally understood. The crushing weight of the flooded barn, the angry vendors, the threatening legal notices, and the public humiliation was not a petty revenge plot I had orchestrated to hurt him. It was simply the bill coming due. The universe was finally collecting on his massive debts, and I was no longer standing in the way to pay them. The mahogany conference table at Pike & Associates felt less like a piece of office furniture and more like an execution block. It was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. I arrived exactly 15 minutes early. I wore a perfectly tailored navy blazer and carried a single, incredibly thin leather folder. It contained no emotional appeals, no printed text messages, and no photographs. It contained only cold, indisputable math. Dinah Pike sat to my right, her posture rigid and professional. Miles Rendon, my forensic accountant, sat to my left. Across from us sat 3 individuals who collectively controlled the actual gravity of Holden's entire world. There was Marcus Thorne, the senior commercial loan officer from the bank that held our mortgage. Beside him was Elena Rostova, the regional director for our commercial liability insurance provider. Rounding out the group was a silent, gray-haired man named Vance, a broker who specialized in distressed asset restructuring and commercial liquidations. At exactly 5 minutes past the hour, the heavy glass door of the conference room swung open. Holden walked in, wearing his signature charcoal suit. He had clearly spent time on his hair that morning, attempting to project the effortless, charismatic aura of a successful Southern gentleman. He flashed a brilliant, practiced smile, entirely prepared to charm his way through what he assumed was just another tedious administrative hurdle. To my mild surprise, Piper trailed closely behind him. She was clutching a designer handbag against her chest like a shield, her jaw set in a tight line of defiance. She had undoubtedly demanded to be present, completely convinced that this meeting was merely an extension of our family drama and that her upcoming wedding and her assumed inheritance were the most important topics on the agenda. Holden immediately tried to take control of the room. He reached across the table, offering a firm handshake to Marcus Thorne. "Marcus, it is great to see you again," Holden said, his voice dripping with easy confidence. "I apologize for the delay. We had a minor vendor crisis to handle this morning, You know how the hospitality industry is. Always a moving target. Marcus did not smile. He briefly accepted the handshake and gestured to the empty leather chairs opposite the table. Please take a seat, Mr. Bell. We have a substantial amount of material to cover. Holden sat down, unbuttoning his suit jacket. He looked over at me, offering a soft, almost patronizing sigh, as if to say he was willing to indulge my little corporate tantrum. Dinah Pike did not offer him a moment to breathe. She opened her black notebook. We are here today to formally address the critical operational and financial failures of Ashmore Fields, Dana began, her voice devoid of any warmth. As the legal representative for Aria Crawford, the 72% majority shareholder, I have authorized this disclosure of the limited liability company's current standing. Holden shifted in his chair, attempting a light-hearted chuckle. Dana, let us not make this sound like a federal indictment. We are experiencing a temporary cash flow bottleneck due to some unexpected seasonal overhead. Ashmore Fields has incredible brand equity. Our vision for the next calendar year is completely booked out. Marcus Thorne picked up a heavy stack of stapled papers and dropped them squarely onto the mahogany table. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. Mr.
Bell, Marcus said, leaning forward. The bank does not lend millions of dollars based on brand equity or rustic vision. This commercial mortgage exists and has only ever existed because of Aria Crawford.
It was approved strictly due to her flawless credit history, her substantial executive salary, and her willingness to act as the sole personal guarantor. Without her continued financial subsidization, our risk assessment department classifies your venue as an immediate, high-risk default. You do not have the liquid capital to service the debt. Holden's smile faltered, the edges of his mouth tightening. He opened his mouth to pivot the conversation, but Elena Rostova, the insurance director, seamlessly cut him off. Furthermore, Elena stated, adjusting her reading glasses, we have reviewed the recent damage to the east wing roof, alongside your failure to satisfy the county fire marshal citations. Combine that with your failure to remit the premium payments for the past 60 days, and your policy is now officially in breach. If the structural repairs and the compliance codes are not satisfied within 14 business days, we will formally revoke your certificate of liability. You will not be legally permitted to host a single guest on the property. If you attempt to hold an event, the county authorities will physically padlock your gates. The color rapidly drained from Holden's face. He looked at me, a flash of genuine panic finally breaking through his polished veneer. He realized, in that specific moment, that his charm had absolutely no currency in this room. Miles Rendon opened his white binder. He did not look at Holden. He simply looked at the spreadsheet. I have completed a forensic reconciliation of the operating accounts over the past 36 months, Miles said, his voice operating like a metronome. He slid a single, highlighted piece of paper across the table toward Holden. I have itemized the continuous, unauthorized diversion of corporate funds for your personal lifestyle expenses, vacations, luxury car rentals, and private dining. Holden swallowed hard. He tried to lean back and cross his arms, adopting a defensive posture. Look, I manage a massive operation. The bookkeeping might be a little loose, but those were creative business expenses. Networking, client acquisition. They were misappropriations, Mr. Bell. Miles corrected him instantly, his tone flat and unyielding. You use the business accounts to bypass your lack of personal income. You cannot claim loose management when the paper trail clearly shows you deliberately pushed personal luxury expenses onto a ledger solely funded by your wife. Piper, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly slammed her hand down on the armrest of her chair. Her face was flushed with hot, entitled rage. She glared directly at me. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Piper snapped, her voice shrill and echoing in the sterile room. "You are bringing all these strangers in here just to ruin my life. That venue is a family asset. My wedding is the absolute priority right now. The farmhouse is my home. You cannot just come in here and shut down our family estate because you are throwing a jealous fit." The room fell dead silent. Dana raised an eyebrow. Marcus Thorne slowly turned his head to look at Piper. He looked at her not with anger, but with the cold, absolute indifference of a man who only respects legal documentation. "Miss," Marcus said, his voice incredibly dry, "I do not know what you have been told regarding your status, but I hold the property deed and the operating charter right here in my hands. Your name appears absolutely nowhere. You hold 0% equity. You are not a signatory on the mortgage. Legally speaking, you do not possess a family estate. You are simply a temporary guest residing on a commercially zoned property that is overwhelmingly owned by Aria Crawford." Piper's mouth fell open. The absolute certainty of her inheritance, the crown she had worn so proudly in front of her friends, shattered into dust on the conference table. She slowly turned to look at her father, waiting for him to forcefully correct the banker, to defend her honor, to tell them all that she was the rightful heir. Holden did not say a word. He stared down at his leather shoes, completely paralyzed. Dana Pike leaned forward, delivering the final, calculated blow. "The terms are non-negotiable," Dana stated clearly. "You have two options, Mr. Bell. Option 1 requires you to source legitimate, legally verifiable outside capital to purchase Aria's 72% share at the current fair market value, while simultaneously reimbursing the business for the misappropriated funds. You have exactly 30 days to secure this financing." Dana gestured to the silent, gray-haired man sitting at the end of the table. "Option 2 is immediate liquidation, Mr. Vance here is prepared to list the entirety of Ashmore Fields, including the farmhouse, on the commercial real estate market immediately. The assets will be sold, the commercial debts will be cleared, and the remaining profits will be divided according to the ownership split. It is the only mathematical way to halt the impending bankruptcy." Holden sat frozen in his chair. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning was the only sound in the room. He did not yell. He did not try to negotiate. He did not flash a charming smile. For the first time in the 5 years I had known him, Holden Bell was completely stripped of his illusions. He sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, surrounded by professionals who only cared about the brutal reality of numbers. And he finally understood the magnitude of his fatal error. He looked at me, his eyes wide and hollow. He realized that I was not the quiet, convenient background to his brilliant life. I was the structural foundation he had arrogantly stood upon, and he had just watched me walk entirely out from under his feet. 48 hours after the meeting at the law firm, Ashmore Fields officially hit the commercial real estate market. Vance, the restructuring broker, did not waste a single minute. He utilized a premium hospitality network to blast the listing across the country. I sat at my glass dining table, drinking black coffee, and scrolled through the digital brochure on my laptop. It was a masterpiece of marketing. The photographer had captured the property exactly as I had originally envisioned it 5 years ago. There were sweeping drone shots of the rolling Kentucky bluegrass, close-ups of the reclaimed barnwood, and golden hour photographs of the farmhouse. Every single angle highlighted in the brochure was an angle I had personally chosen during our very first walkthrough of the ruined property. I had seen the potential before anyone else. Now, that same potential was being packaged and sold to the highest bidder to cover my husband's debts. The reality of the public listing sent Holden into a frantic, chaotic spiral. With his financial leverage completely gone and his public image actively disintegrating, he resorted to his final remaining weapon. He tried to manipulate my emotions. He showed up unannounced at the lobby of my apartment building on a Thursday evening. I allowed the concierge to send him up, knowing that avoiding him would only make him feel powerful. When I opened the door, he looked exhausted. The polished Southern gentleman routine was entirely fractured. He stepped into my sterile, modern living room and immediately launched into a desperately curated monologue. He cycled through every emotional tactic he had successfully used on me in the past. First, he tried guilt and blame. He paced across the hardwood floor, waving his hands. "I cannot believe you are actually doing this," Holden said, his voice thick with exaggerated betrayal. "You are throwing away years of our lives over a single misunderstanding. You are embarrassing us in front of the entire county. Vance is bringing strangers onto the property while my daughter is trying to plan her wedding." When I did not react, he quickly pivoted to a half-hearted, manipulative apology. He stopped pacing and looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. "Look, I am sorry about the money," he murmured. Stepping closer, "I got sloppy. I wanted to give Piper a good life, and I wanted to impress Grant's family. I put too much pressure on the business. I know that now, but we can fix this. You just have to pull the listing. Come home. Arya. We built that place together." Finally, when my silence remained absolute, he resorted to insulting my character. He crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "This is just about your ego, is it not?" Holden sneered, his tone turning bitter and sharp. "You got your feelings hurt because Piper made a joke at dinner. And now you are burning the whole house down just to prove you have the matches. You are making a massive mistake just because your pride is bruised." I stood leaning against the kitchen counter. I felt no urge to yell, no desire to justify my actions, and absolutely no temptation to save him. "I am not making a mistake, Holden," I said, my voice perfectly level and quiet. "And I am not destroying a family. I simply stopped holding up a system that never considered me family." That single sentence completely severed his momentum. The air rushed out of his lungs. He opened his mouth to argue, but there was nothing left to say. The truth was absolute. He turned around and walked out of my apartment, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Back at the property, the family dynamics were imploding in spectacular fashion. Piper, entirely stripped of her delusions of grandeur, finally realized that the man she had idolized possessed absolutely no real power. The farmhouse she had claimed as her kingdom was being actively shown to corporate investors. Her fury, which had previously been directed solely at me, violently shifted toward her father. Holden later admitted to Dana in a frantic phone call that Piper was screaming at him daily. She demanded to know why he had lied to her about the deed, why he had no money of his own, and why he was allowing a broker to walk strangers through her living room. Her absolute confidence shattered because it had always been built on the imaginary inheritance he had falsely promised her. The ultimate humiliation for Piper, however, came from the Mercer family. Grant's parents, Richard and Eleanor, were old money. They abhorred public scandal and financial instability. When the commercial listing for Ashmore Fields became public knowledge, they immediately recognized the massive liability. They saw that the grand venue where they were supposed to host hundreds of their wealthy friends was actively facing bankruptcy and liquidation. Sloane, the wedding planner, sent me a quiet professional email to formally sever our contract, but she included a highly revealing detail. Eleanor Mercer had officially pulled all funding for the lavish rehearsal dinner she was supposed to host on the property. Furthermore, Grant had abruptly moved out of the farmhouse and temporarily relocated to his parents' estate in Lexington, citing a need for space amidst the family chaos. The wedding was not officially canceled, but the Mercer family was rapidly building a firewall to protect themselves from the Bell family collapse. For Piper, losing the social validation of her wealthy future in-laws was a wound infinitely deeper than any reprimand I could have ever delivered. Desperate to maintain some semblance of control, Holden attempted to sabotage the sale. He started hiding official correspondence from the bank. When Vance scheduled a high-value property tour with a regional hospitality conglomerate, Holden deliberately changed the access codes to the main wrought iron gates and refused to answer his cell phone. He thought he could stall the inevitable by acting like a petulant child locking his bedroom door. Dana Pike completely dismantled his rebellion within 4 hours. She dispatched a legal courier directly to the venue with a drafted emergency injunction. The document explicitly cited Section 7 of the Limited Liability Company Operating Agreement, which detailed severe financial penalties for any minority shareholder who intentionally obstructed the fiduciary duties of a court-mandated sale. She informed Holden that if he locked the gates again, she would legally compel him to vacate the premises immediately, leaving him homeless before the sale even closed. The gate codes were restored 20 minutes later. Meanwhile, the town of Lexington was actively whispering, in a community tightly bound by high-end hospitality and old money. A public collapse of this magnitude was premium gossip. Holden had always relied on his charm to manage the local narrative, assuming the town would view him as the tragic victim of a ruthless corporate wife. But the narrative completely escaped his control. The vendors in the county, the florists, the caterers, the lighting technicians, and the linen suppliers were the ones steering the conversation. They all knew the truth. They knew that for the past 5 years, whenever an invoice was dangerously late, it was my personal credit card that cleared the balance. They knew I was the one who quietly fixed the schedules, managed the panic, and protected their livelihoods. When Holden attempted to garner sympathy at the local country club, he was met with polite, icy smiles. The people who actually made the town run knew exactly who had built Ashmore Fields, and they knew exactly why it was falling apart. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 2 weeks before the final closing date, I drove out to the venue one last time. I did not go to the main house or the barns. I drove straight to the converted grain silo that served as the administrative office. The property was eerily silent. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. I brought a single, medium-sized cardboard box. I walked over to my desk tucked in the corner. I packed my framed college diploma, a heavy crystal paperweight my father had given me, and my favorite titanium pen. I deliberately left everything else. I looked at the massive corkboard covering the back wall. It was pinned with fabric swatches, sample velvet ribbons, and glossy photographs of potential lighting installations. Those items represented hundreds of hours of my unpaid labor. They represented the shared dream I had financed with my own blood and sweat. I did not touch them. I picked up my single cardboard box and walked out the door. I felt a profound, beautiful lightness in my chest. I had finally learned the most expensive lesson of my life. I had spent years confusing sacrifice with love, believing that if I just gave enough, fixed enough, and endured enough, I would eventually earn my place in their family. As I locked the office door and dropped the key into the mail slot, I knew I would never make that mistake again. I walked to my car, placed the box in the passenger seat, and drove away from the empire I built, completely ready to let it burn. The ticking clock began the exact moment Vance, our restructuring broker, forwarded a formal letter of intent to my secure inbox. The document was pristine, ruthless, and entirely devoid of emotion. A highly successful regional hospitality conglomerate, a group famous for acquiring distressed premium properties and transforming them into high-end weekend destination retreats, had submitted a serious cash offer. They wanted the entirety of Ashmore Fields. They also explicitly included the farmhouse in their acquisition plan, intending to completely gut the interior and convert it into a flagship bridal luxury suite. The purchase price was substantial enough to completely clear the commercial mortgage, satisfy all outstanding vendor liens, and leave a very clean profit to be divided according to our ownership percentages. But the most devastating detail of the contract was the aggressive timeline. The corporate buyers demanded an expedited escrow period. The final closing date, the exact day the keys and deeds would legally change hands, landed precisely 3 days before Piper was scheduled to host her heavily publicized rehearsal dinner on the property. Holden immediately recognized the catastrophic timing. Faced with the absolute destruction of his daughter's wedding stage and the total evaporation of his own public standing, he reverted to his oldest survival mechanism. He tried to stall. He blatantly ignored urgent emails from Dana Pike. He conveniently forgot to digitally initial the mandatory preliminary seller disclosures. He attempted to argue that we needed at least 45 more days to evaluate secondary offers that did not actually exist. In his fractured reality, he firmly believed this was simply a high-stakes game of chicken. He was absolutely convinced that as the final deadline rapidly approached, I would miraculously soften. He thought that the sheer social terror of ruining a wedding, of humiliating him in front of the Mercer family and the entire county, would eventually force me to pull the listing. He kept waiting for the devoted, supportive wife to step back into her designated role and rescue him from the fire. He was not the only one frantically trying to manipulate the outcome. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, my phone lit up with a massive text message from Piper. It was a jarring departure from her previous venomous attacks. "Arya, I know things have been incredibly tense between everyone lately, and I hate that we are fighting," Piper wrote, the digital words dripping with manufactured sweetness. "Dad is a complete wreck, and I just want us to be a family again. This whole selling the venue thing is going way too far. Please, let us just sit down, talk this out, and cancel the broker. I really need you there for my big day. We can fix this misunderstanding." I read the message while standing by my kitchen window. It was a fascinating psychological performance. She was suddenly playing the peacemaker, offering me an imaginary seat at a family table that had never actually existed. But I saw the glaring omission in her text. She did not apologize for treating me like the hired help. She did not acknowledge the financial blood I had poured into her lifestyle. She was simply terrified that her perfect, rustic fairy tale backdrop was about to be bulldozed by corporate investors. She was negotiating for the venue, not for me. I deleted the message without typing a single word in response. As the escrow clock ticked down to the final 7 days, Holden realized his stalling tactics were completely failing. Desperate and utterly out of options, he made one final, catastrophic miscalculation. He bypassed all legal and professional channels and secretly approached Richard Mercer, Grant's wealthy father. Holden invited Richard to a private lunch at the country club and asked for a massive, private bridge loan to buy out my 72% equity stake and save the property. Richard Mercer was an old money patriarch who had built his vast fortune on calculated risk management. He did not write 7-figure checks based on a firm handshake and a sad story over iced tea. He politely agreed to consider the request, but he immediately unleashed his private wealth management team to conduct a brutal, expedited due diligence audit on the venue's operating history. When Richard's accountants opened the hood of Ashmore Fields, they did not just find a business struggling with seasonal cash flow. They found the completely distorted financial history. They found the extensive ledger entries where Holden had intentionally diverted corporate funds to pay for luxury exotic car rentals, premium resort vacations, and high-end dinners. They saw the total lack of liquid reserves and the overwhelming burden of the personal guarantees I had been carrying entirely alone. The bridge loan request died instantly on the boardroom table. Richard Mercer did not just formally decline to provide the capital. He effectively severed the remaining social and financial ties between the two families. The Mercer family realized Holden was not a visionary entrepreneur experiencing a temporary setback. He was a financial liability running a vanity project on his wife's dime. Holden's secret attempt to save his ego resulted in the spectacular, immediate execution of his character within their elite social circle, back in the legal arena. Dana Pike tolerated absolutely zero delays. When Holden failed to sign the mandatory seller disclosures by 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, Dana did not call him to negotiate. She immediately filed an emergency motion to compel his compliance, legally binding him to the timeline under the explicit threat of holding him in contempt of the operating agreement. I sat in Dana's sleek, soundproof office the following morning, staring down at the thick stack of final closing documents. I picked up the heavy, silver pen she offered me. For a brief second, my fingers trembled. It was a microscopic movement, barely noticeable. I was not trembling from hesitation, and I was certainly not trembling from regret. It was simply the physical adrenaline of ending an era. It was the bodily sensation of dropping a crushing weight I had carried for 5 long years. I pressed the nib to the crisp paper and signed my name. The ink was dark, sharp, and entirely permanent. There were no more extensions. The structural teardown was permanently locked into place. The climax of the ordeal arrived on a rainy evening, exactly 12 hours before the final closing signatures were required from Holden. The intercom in my downtown apartment buzzed. I knew who it was before the concierge even spoke. I authorized him to send my husband up to my floor. When I opened my front door, Holden stood in the hallway. Yeah. The confident, booming Southern charm was entirely gone. He wore a rumpled sweater. His shoulders were slumped, and his eyes carried the heavy, hollow look of a man who had finally hit the absolute bottom of his own denial. He did not try to force his way inside. He stood awkwardly in the threshold, the silence stretching between us like a physical chasm. "Vance called me an hour ago," Holden said, his voice stripped of all its usual theatrical resonance. "The buyers have wired the final funds into the escrow account. It is really happening. Tomorrow morning, it is gone." "Yes," I replied simply, leaning against the doorframe. "It is." He looked down at the hallway carpet, taking a slow, ragged breath. He did not launch into a defensive tirade. He did not hurl insults or attempt to leverage Piper's wedding one last time. The reality of the bank wires and the legal decrees had finally pierced his armor. He looked back up at me, and for the very first time in our entire relationship, he genuinely lowered his voice. "Aria," Holden whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate, agonizing curiosity. "Please tell me the truth. If I had not laughed that night at the dinner, if I had just told Piper to stop, or if I had stood up for you, would we still be here right now? Could I have saved all of this?" I looked at the man I had once loved deeply enough to finance his wildest dreams. I looked at the man who had happily traded my financial security for his own applause. I did not feel a rush of victorious adrenaline. I only felt the cold, clear air of reality. "Maybe," I answered, keeping my voice perfectly steady and clear. "But you laughed way too easily, Holden, because you thought I would always be there to act as the scaffolding for your consequences." I gently pushed the heavy apartment door closed, the lock clicking firmly into place, leaving him standing entirely alone in the quiet hallway to finally pay his own bill. The morning of the closing arrived, draped in a thick gray overcast that felt entirely appropriate. I walked into the title company conference room at exactly 9 o'clock. The air inside was climate-controlled and smelled faintly of floor wax and fresh coffee. Dana Pike was already seated, organizing the final settlement statements. Holden arrived 10 minutes later. The physical toll of the last few weeks was written across his face in deep, unavoidable lines. He looked like a man who had aged 5 years in the span of 30 days. His charcoal suit hung slightly loose on his frame, and the charming spark in his eyes had completely burned out, replaced by the dull, flat gaze of someone who had been forced to read his own financial autopsy. Surprisingly, Piper walked in right behind him. She was hovering in a strange, agonizing purgatory between desperate hope and absolute panic. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, clutching her designer bag, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting a judge to suddenly bang a gavel and declare the entire sale null and void. She still genuinely believed that if she just stood there looking distressed enough, someone would step in and save her rehearsal dinner. The buyers, a team of 3 sharp corporate executives representing the hospitality conglomerate, sat across from us. They did not care about family drama, hurt feelings, or rustic visions. They cared about zoning permits, structural liabilities, and clean titles. The process was brutal in its efficiency. There were no arguments. There was no room for Holden to negotiate or charm. The executive slid thick stacks of paper across the table. I signed my name where Dana pointed. Holden signed his name, his hand moving sluggishly, as if the pen weighed 50 pounds. Then came the digital handover. It was the most definitive moment of the morning. The lead executive opened his laptop and asked for the master administrative passwords to the venue's security systems, the banking portals, and the vendor management software. As Holden quietly recited the passwords, the executive's assistant immediately logged in and reset every single one of them. The wrought iron gates at Ashmore Fields, the electronic locks on the converted barns, and the security panel at the farmhouse were instantly transferred to a corporate server in a different time zone. The codes were not changed because of a petty, vindictive scheme on my part. They were changed because that is simply how a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition works. The machine simply reassigned ownership. That was the exact second the reality finally shattered Piper's delusion. She sat in the corner chair, watching the executive close his laptop. "Wait," Piper said, her voice trembling, stepping forward. "What about my rehearsal dinner?" "It is literally scheduled for this Friday. You cannot just lock us out. My vendors need access tomorrow morning to set up the floral arches." "I live in the farmhouse." The lead executive looked at her with mild, polite confusion. He glanced at Holden, then back to Piper. "I apologize, Miss," the executive said, his tone entirely professional and devoid of any sympathy. "But all previous events and unauthorized residential occupancies are officially nullified as of this exact moment. The property is now an active commercial construction site. Our renovation crews are scheduled to begin gutting the farmhouse tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the morning. You will need to remove your personal belongings by 5 o'clock this evening, or they will be placed in a commercial storage unit at your expense." Piper let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The entire narrative she had built, the fairy tale wedding, the inherited estate, the beautiful photograph she had planned to post, evaporated into the sterile air of the conference room. She turned to her father, expecting him to fight for her. Holden just stared at the table. He had absolutely nothing left to sell. Piper burst into tears, a loud, heavy sobbing that echoed awkwardly in the quiet room. She turned around and practically ran out of the office, the heavy glass door slamming shut behind her, as the executives packed up their briefcases and shook Dana's hand. Holden made one final, desperate attempt to pull me aside. He stood near the doorway, blocking my exit just slightly. "Arya, please," Holden whispered, his voice cracking. "Can we just talk, just for 10 minutes? Let me buy you a cup of coffee. We need to figure out what happens next. We need to talk about us." I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a quiet, profound relief. In the past, I would have stayed. I would have listened to his promises, his vague excuses, and his desperate plans for a better future. But the landscape had fundamentally changed. Everything had transitioned from raw emotion to binding signatures. There was no more gray area left to exploit. "There's no US to figure out. Holden," I said softly, my voice calm and completely steady. "Everything moved from what if to it is done the moment you signed those papers. There is nothing left to talk about." I stepped past him and walked over to the lead executive. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out the single, heavy brass master key that I had carried on my wrist for 5 years. I handed it to the executive. My hand was perfectly steady. My face was calm, perhaps even a little cold. I was not being heartless. I was simply empty. I had already finished mourning the death of this marriage and this dream weeks ago. Sitting alone in my car outside a tasting dinner, the grief was gone. Only the logistics remained. I walked out of the building and stepped into the cool, gray morning air. As I unlocked my car, my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out, expecting a frantic text from Holden or another venomous message from Vanessa. Instead, it was a message from Sarah, the veteran wedding coordinator who had resigned weeks earlier. "I heard the news about the corporate buyout today," Sarah wrote. "I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for finally stopping. If you had kept writing the checks and saving the schedule, they would have just kept living right on your back forever. And they would have kept calling it being a family. You did the right thing. I am proud of you." I read the message twice. A small, genuine smile touched my lips. I locked my phone, started the engine, and drove away. 3 days later, the escrow funds cleared. I received my 72% share of the sale. It was not the kind of lottery wealth that buys private jets or islands. It was something much better. It was clean, quiet, and absolutely real. It was enough money to completely secure my future. I used a portion of it to buy a beautiful, historic brick townhouse in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood in Louisville. The space was entirely mine. There was no reclaimed barnwood, no massive hospitality ledgers, and no demanding stepdaughters. I spent my weekends slowly furnishing the rooms. I picked out a deep green velvet sofa, a solid walnut dining table, and pieces of art that I actually loved. Every single item in the house was paid for by me, chosen by me, and belonged exclusively to me. The greatest lesson I learned from Ashmore Fields had nothing to do with commercial real estate or legal contracts. It was a lesson about the absolute value of my own peace. People will eagerly label a woman as being too sensitive, too dramatic, or too demanding the exact moment she stops allowing them to consume her silence, her competence, and her endless endurance as a free, infinite resource. When I finally decided to step back and remove myself from the equation, I did not have to plot an elaborate scheme to destroy Holden Bell. I did not have to scream, or throw wine, or ruin his reputation. All I had to do was stop paying for the illusion. I simply stepped aside, and reality handled him all by itself. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please make sure to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel. Leave a like on this video and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can reach even more people who might need to hear it.